Bibliophiles of the internet. As a longtime fantasy reader myself, I thought I would put together a little starter pack for folks who might be new to the genre and also make it comprised entirely of standalone fantasy books. A few things to start off. Firstly, I made a similar video last year that I called my Sci-Fi starter pack, so if Sci-Fi is more your speed, definitely check that out. The one slight difference is that there might be some series starters included in that video. I have not gone back to check, but I'm pretty sure, so keep that in mind. Secondly, let's take a moment to talk about how I put together this video. I wanted to focus on standalones because I think the fantasy genre especially can feel very intimidating and overwhelming sometimes. There's a ton of very long fantasy series out there. It can be confusing to know where to start, so I think starting with standalones makes the most sense. Additionally, if you're someone who's already familiar with the fantasy genre, a lot of your faves are most likely not going to be on this list because I wanted to be very intentional in making this a beginner-friendly resource. So for example, The Spear Cuts Through Water is an S tier, God tier standalone fantasy book. Is it going to be on this list? No, it's not. Not because I don't think it deserves to be, but because I personally would not recommend it as a starting point. And I think we should also take a moment to define what I classify as fantasy, at least for my purposes here as it pertains to this video. I would define fantasy as any story that incorporates surreal or magical elements of any kind. These stories can be set in a fantasy world, in an imaginary realm, they can contain fantastical creatures, or they can be set in a world that's very similar to ours except with magical components. I would also go further and say that the fantastical or magical elements have to make up a significant part of the story. Like the plot has to hinge on those fantastical elements for a story to really be considered a capital F, capital B fantasy book. Again, that's definitely not a set in stone definitive definition on what fantasy is or what fantasy can be. It's just a loose working definition for the purposes of this video. I think that's pretty much all the housekeeping stuff. I've also split this into 3 age categories: middle grade, young adult, and adult, with 5 recommendations or suggested titles for each section. So let's get started. Starting with middle grade, a magical standalone book I would recommend is a book that happened to be one of my favorite books of last year. That was A Split Second by Janae Marks. This story is about Elise, who wakes up the morning after her birthday feeling very disoriented. The last thing she recalls is falling asleep with her best friends at her slumber party in October, but now she's by herself, the calendar says it's April, and it seems that she's somehow skipped the last 6 months. No one else is acting like anything strange happened, even though Elise has no memory of what happened since her birthday party. But now her friends are no longer speaking to her, she's somehow been signed up for the photography club, and as she desperately tries to figure out how to fix everything, she's beginning to suspect that this is not a case of memory loss, but perhaps some very tricky magic. Admittedly, this story is a little bit lighter on the fantastical elements, but again, the plot itself very much hinges on this element of time magic, so I think it could be a good stepping stone as you work your way up to more transportative or immersive fantasy stories. And everything Janae writes is just wonderful. This is a really heartfelt story about a young character bravely navigating what it means to outgrow parts of yourself and process the grief that comes with that while still growing forward. It's everything Janae Marks does best, but with a really fun, magical twist. Speaking of winding back the clock, I have to recommend a classic children's fantasy book that I discovered in my childhood and still very much love to this day. That is The Phantom Tollbooth by Norton Juster. This remains one of the most imaginative, distinctive, and creative fantasy stories I've ever read. It's about this young listless boy named Milo who doesn't see the point in doing anything or caring about anything, but one day he comes home from school to discover a mysterious package in his home, and in that package is a tiny car and a tiny toll booth to match. When he gets into the car and drives through the toll booth, he is transported to a completely different fantasy world, a world that is divided into 2 warring kingdoms, the kingdom of numbers and the kingdom of words. These 2 kingdoms used to be ruled peacefully by the 2 princesses, Rhyme and Reason, who have somehow vanished, and Milo is set on a journey to figure out what happened to them and how he can bring them back. I just love this zany, satirical, ridiculous fantasy world. All the fantasy elements are built off of idioms, which is so clever and so fun. The story takes those idioms and makes them into very literal magical obstacles that Milo and his friends have to work through and overcome. There's also a really satisfying character arc for Milo, who starts off at a very low point and eventually rediscovers his sense of wonder and his joy for life. So yes, this book might have been published over 60 years ago at this point, but I happen to think it's still fantastic. I think another good starting point for middle grade readers would be The Curse of Eelgrass Bog by Mary Averling. This story is about a young character named Kess who doesn't live a very normal life. Her family runs an unnatural history museum, her hobbies include hunting for megafauna fossils and skeletons, and her best friend is a talking demon's head trapped in a jar that she calls Shrunken Jim. When a new girl in town comes to Kes asking for help in breaking a mysterious curse, all clues lead back to Eelgrass Bog, which is known for being full of witches, demons, and possibly worse. But as the two of them begin investigating, Kes realizes that this curse might hit closer to home than she first thought, and she'll have to summon all her courage to find a way to break the curse before it's too late. I haven't read this one yet, but I've heard really great things about it. Just from the synopsis, you can already tell that it's walking that fine line between humor and darkness. It seems chock full of magical creatures and fantastical obstacles as well, so I think it would be a really fun book to read for readers of all ages. Then we have the novelization of Kiki's Delivery Service by Eiko Kadano, translated by Emily Ballestretti from the original Japanese. This is of course based on the classic Miyazaki film of the same name. It's about a half-witch named Kiki who has to follow the witch's tradition of choosing a new town to call home for one calendar year after turning 13. So she travels to a small seaside village where she's sure that she can bring happiness to the townspeople with her magic. But it's much harder to gain the trust of the townspeople than she originally thought, so it's going to take a lot of work to forge some new friendships, build her inner strength, and prove that magic can be found in even the most ordinary of places. I'm a huge fan of this movie, and I would definitely consider it to be a staple of the genre. It's really sweet and fun and heartfelt, so whether you're looking for an entryway into the movie or if you want to read something that gives you that nostalgia and those same good feelings, this would be a great choice. Lastly, for this category, I would also like to suggest The Ink Witch by Steph Cherrywell, which is a more recent release. This is written by a non-binary author and I believe stars a trans femme main character, Becca, who's tired of helping out at her family's inn and also constantly dealing with her overprotective mom. But during an unexpected visit from her estranged aunt, she discovers that she is the niece of one of the most powerful witches there is, and that her mom happens to be a witch without magic. When Becca's mom refuses to help her sister take control of the family throne, Becca's aunt puts her under a curse. So now Becca has to set out to uncover her own magical abilities and find the ingredients to a potion that might just save her mom's life. There's a lot about this story that I find really appealing. It has a lot of those classic magical quest elements, but it's also told from a unique and refreshing perspective. So it definitely seems like a fun and exciting magical adventure to enjoy. Moving on to YA fantasy, we of course have to start with an author who has mastered the art of the standalone fantasy novel, and of course that is none other than F.T. Lukens, which is why I would definitely recommend So This Is Ever After by F.T. Lukens. F.T. Lukens is known for writing queer, silly, romantic fantasy stories of all kinds. This is a unique take on a fantasy adventure because it's asking the question of what happens after the kingdom has been saved and the epic quest is finally complete. The story follows Arik, who just fulfilled a prophecy by saving the kingdom from an evil usurper, but it's not until afterwards that he and his crew realize that they never made a plan for who would take the usurper's place. So Arik volunteers to be that placeholder ruler, and at first everything is fine, but then he realizes that sitting on the throne comes with a magical catch. He has to choose a spouse by his 18th birthday, which is coming up very soon, or wither away into nothing. So he and his crew embark on a desperate bid to somehow find him a spouse, and it might take quite a few mishaps for him to realize that maybe his soulmate is much closer than he thinks. When it comes to really fun, original, quirky fantasy standalones, F.T. Lukens' catalog is an absolute treasure trove. There is so much to choose from, there's so much to enjoy. This is just a really humorous look at how there's no handbook when it comes to ruling a kingdom, and there's so many growing pains the characters have to endure along the way, both politically and in a personal sense. If you love whimsical, folkloric fantasy stories with a heavy dose of romance, you should definitely check out Where the Dark Stands Still by A.B. Pornek. This is a really beautiful, lush, imaginative, fairy tale-esque story about a girl named Lishka who possesses very dangerous and unwieldy magical powers, and she has tried everything she can to suppress that magic. In one last desperate attempt to get rid of it, she flees into the forest in search of this mythical magical flower, and the story goes that if she can find that flower, she will be granted a single wish. But before she can find it, she's caught by the demon warden of the woods, who makes her a different offer: 1 year of servitude in exchange for both the flower and the wish. But as she begins to make a home in the warden's crumbling forest manor, she realizes that she is not the first person to strike this bargain, and if she wants to meet a different fate than her predecessors, she'll have to unravel the warden's secrets and confront the ghosts of his past. I love this book so much. It's basically a Polish-inspired take on Howl's Moving Castle. It has those same vibes. It's delightful, it's cozy, it's enchanting. There's a really wonderful connection between these two characters who seem like they couldn't be more different at first glance, but are actually both struggling to gain some semblance of control over their lives. I just think this is such a wonderful, memorable story with really strong elements of found family and self-discovery. I truly cannot recommend it enough. I also highly recommend Tim Maro and the Subterranean Heartsick Blues by H.S. Valley. This is another really fun, zany, queer YA fantasy story. It's set at a magic school, and it's about two rivals, Tim and Elliot, who were planning to work with their respective romantic partners on this huge upcoming class project. But they both get dumped the day before the assignment starts, and now they have to work with each other instead. The assignment is to care for an enchanted egg baby, basically to prove that they have parenting skills. And the more they begin to bond over their cute, magical egg, the more they realize that their mutual animosity might be nothing more than a foil for their mutual attraction. I read this book many years ago at this point, and I still think about it all the time. I love romances that dabble in accidental domesticity, and this book definitely has that in spades. I think this would also be a great starting point for someone just getting into fantasy because the magic system and the magic world building isn't very involved or complicated. The only thing you need to understand to enjoy the story is the fact that magic exists in this world. Another YA fantasy standalone I really enjoyed was A Far Wilder Magic by Alison Saft. This is basically a Full Metal Alchemist Royai fantasy AU. It's set in this wild woodland fantasy world where a sharpshooter known as Margaret desperately wants to join what's known as the legendary Half Moon Hunt. This is a once-in-a-generation event where the townspeople try to track down this mythical creature known as the Hala, which is the last of its kind. And Margaret believes that if she joins the hunt, finds the creature, and wins the highly coveted prize, that means her absent mother will finally have to come home. However, people can only officially join the hunt in teams of two. There has to be a sharpshooter and an alchemist. So when an aspiring alchemist named Weston shows up on Margaret's doorstep hoping to secure an apprenticeship with Margaret's mom, she begrudgingly allows him to stay, but only if he will team up with her to join the hunt. This story has a very cozy, fall-forward aesthetic. It's atmospheric, it's deeply romantic, it's delightfully domestic. So much of this story is about these two prickly characters begrudgingly sharing space with each other and learning what makes the other person tick. There's strong fantastical undercurrents to the story, what with the magic surrounding the Hala and the secret workings of alchemy, so there's a lot of really interesting elements to sink your teeth into. And lastly, for YA fantasy, I think I want to recommend The Darkest Part of the Forest by Holly Black. This is one of Holly Black's rare standalone fantasy books. It's about a young girl named Hazel and her brother Ben who live in the town of Fairfold where humans and fae coexist. Deep in the woods, there's this boy with horns on his head sleeping eternally in a glass coffin, and he slept there for generations without ever waking, until one day he finally does, and everything is thrown out of balance. This is also very queer, by the way, because there's definitely a romance between the fae boy in the glass coffin and Hazel's brother Ben. I know Holly Black's books can be fairly divisive. I tend to enjoy her fae stories. They're lush and dark and romantic. This book in particular was one of the first books that introduced me to the concept of badass lady knights. I have to admit I did read this one over a decade ago at this point, and I don't remember all the finer details, but it has stuck with me all that time, and I think if you enjoy dark, lovely stories about fae magic, this could be a great choice. Now we're going to talk about adult fantasy, starting with a book I read towards the end of last year, which was An Academy for Liars by Alexis Henderson. This is a blend of dark academia, fantasy, and even some horror elements. It's about a character named Lennon who just discovered that her fiancé has been cheating on her with one of her closest friends, and it isn't until she breaks off the engagement and leaves him that she realizes that she's based so much of her life around his career and his lifestyle, and now she doesn't really know what to do with herself. That's when she receives this mysterious phone call out of nowhere inviting her to take the entrance exam for Drayton College, a school of magic that teaches its students the dark art of persuasion, the ability to control will, control others, and in rare cases, control matter itself. I love how dark and deeply fucked up this story is. It pulls no punches when it comes to exploring the deep levels of corruption at the heart of the education system, especially when it comes to privately funded institutions. And it isn't afraid to say the quiet part out loud in terms of how power will inevitably be abused and misused wherever power exists. And I think this could be a good gateway book because it's partially grounded in the world as we know it, but there's also more layers to pick apart with this hidden magical school and the implications of the dark magic being taught within its walls. If you're looking for a more unique, sort of medieval feeling fantasy, then I suggest you check out The West Passage by Jared Pachekek. This is a very strange yet enticing fantasy story set in a palace the size of a city that's ruled over by giant ladies of unknowable eldritch origins. They basically guard the palace and protect humans from a terrible beast that lurks beneath the surface. One day, the guardian of the West Passage passes away in her sleep, and even though she was supposed to appoint a successor before her death, a replacement was never named, which means the passage is now unprotected. So it's up to her nameless apprentice to journey to the nearest tower, the Black Tower, to convey his mistress's final message, which is that the beast is soon to be upon them. I think this would be a great place to start if you want a little bit more of a challenge, but not much, especially if you enjoy stories that have a traditional framework but are just a little bit strange, a little bit off-center, a little off-kilter. In so many ways, this story very much feels like a classic medieval quest, but it's also very dark. It takes a lot of narrative risks. It hinges on its own bizarre internal logic. It's very different, but in my opinion, still accessible and approachable, and still very much worth the read. Another author with a ton of great fantasy standalones in her backlog is T. Kingfisher. She has so many incredible standalone fantasies to choose from, but I went with one of her latest, which is Hemlock Silver. This is a very clever and original reimagining of the classic Snow White tale. It's about a healer named Anya who has studied the intricacies of poison her entire life, and that's why when a mysterious illness begins afflicting the princess, she is summoned to investigate by the king himself. While she finds herself against the clock, desperately trying to track down the source of poison killing the princess, she happens to discover a strange alternate world lurking behind the surface of a mirror, which might just hold the truth behind not only the source of poison, but also secrets buried deep in the kingdom's past. Again, T. Kingfisher has so many great fantasy standalones in her backlist. I highly recommend looking into it, but I chose to highlight this title specifically because I think as a fairy tale retelling, it offers a really accessible entry point. And what I love about this retelling especially is that it plays with those classic recognizable parts of the Snow White fairy tale in really fascinating and unique ways. It blends fairy tale and mystery together to come up with a really fascinating, refreshing take. Now, you know I couldn't make this video without talking about my man, P. Djeli Clark. He also has a lot of really great standalone fantasy novellas to choose from, but I'm going with The Dead Cattail Assassins. This story is about an undead assassin named Avine, who is the best assassin in her guild. She's strong, she's professional, she's immaculate in her kills, and she always makes sure to follow the 3 unbreakable vows that she's sworn to the matron of assassins. First, every contract must be just. Second, assassins can only kill those they've been contracted to kill. And third, once you accept a job, you have to see it through to the end, no matter what. But all of that is thrown into question when Avine's latest mission brings her face to face with a past she's not supposed to remember and a vow she can never forget. If you want to get a feel for everything P. Djeli Clark does best, I think this is a really great starting point. It's a sleek and sexy fantasy novella about assassins that goes all the places you would expect, but also has a complex underlying plot that keeps you guessing the whole way through. And the narrative voice is also really fun because Avine has this edgy sort of dry humor that's really entertaining to read, but she's also undeniably a badass. Lastly for today, I would also recommend A Taste of Gold and Iron by Alexandra Rowland. This is a queer romantic fantasy. It's a political fantasy as well. It's set in a world very loosely inspired by the Ottoman Empire and follows Prince Kado, who is incredibly shy and anxious, and in a very unfortunate turn of events, he is wrongfully accused of attempting to stage a royal coup. Because of those damning accusations, he's been banned from court, he's been dishonored and publicly shamed, and his sister, who happens to be the queen, decides to overhaul his personal guard and hire one of the royal guard's most promising cadets, who is incredibly stoic, self-disciplined, and strict. In a desperate attempt to win back his sister's trust, Kado and his guard began investigating a break-in at one of their guilds, and not only accidentally uncover a sinister political conspiracy, but also begin to fall for each other in the process. This book is a little bit on the longer side, but I actually think it goes by pretty quickly, especially because the characters and the budding relationship at the center of the story are so compelling and so dynamic. And while this story can definitely be more serious at times, especially with this conspiracy the characters are unraveling as the story progresses, it's also really silly and goofy and sweet and deeply unserious in ways I don't think you would expect. So if you're someone who's looking for a fantasy standalone that tickles both your brain and your heart in equal measure, that balances both the fantasy and romantic elements in really thoughtful ways, then I think this would be a great choice. So there you have it. Those are 15 standalone fantasy books that I think would be a great starting point for anyone new to the genre. Of course, there are so many more fantasy standalones than just the ones I've shown here today. If you want me to make another video with even more fantasy standalones, definitely let me know, or feel free to recommend your own favorites down below in the comments. Thank you so much for watching. I hope you enjoyed, and until next time, educate yourself, be kind to yourself, take care of yourself and others, and I will catch you on the flip side of the page. Bye!